Hey guys, it's Mexi. Welcome to another video. I am sorry about this lighting. It's been raining like crazy in Toronto all week, and my trusted window is failing me. No, God! But today I'm doing actually kind of a collab again with Mad Blender and Vegan Sista. We were talking about institutional racism, and for me this was kind of inspired by ContraPoint's video on Baltimore, so I will link that. You can check it out. It's basically like all the people who used to come up and ask me like, what is institutional racism? Like, what is, what is patriarchy? Can you explain that to me in like one sentence? Like, no, I can't fucking explain that to you in one sentence. Like, this is the kind of video that I would have loved to show to people, to be like, this is institutional racism. Like, fuck, man, you have to actually look into the different cases. But anyway, I digress. So Mad Blender is going to be talking about, I believe, the prison system in the US, and Vegan Sista is going to be talking about gentrification in Chicago. So I'll be looking at basically the plight of First Nations in Canada, colonial-capitalist exploitation of First Nations in Canada, which is just like crazy. There's honestly so much that could be said about this. To keep this brief, I'm going to talk about like kind of what I know, which is like conservation stuff, resource development stuff, consultation stuff, and yeah. So obviously colonialism and capitalism are very, interlinked. Most of the industrializing nations, especially in Europe, would never have made their wealth without exploiting the colonies, exploiting the resources, exploiting the people, and it obviously created the conditions for, neo-colonialism, imperialism, where, developed nations that develop themselves off the backs of the colonies then go in through, liberalization policies and exploit former colonies economically. So economic exploitation of the former colonies is what I mean by neo-colonialism. Settler colonialism is a bit different because you actually go and settle the place. So it's not even just exploitation of the resources, exploitation of the people. It is settling the land, and so just stealing all of that land. So Canada is a settler colonial state founded on the violent dispossession of First Nations from their lands. And it's important that we think about colonialism as an ongoing process and as, a structure, and not as an event that occurred in the past, right, that we somehow move forward from. Because as Alfred and Tompkins say, settlers have rewritten histories, have created a legal system that justifies their rule, and have normalized a racist and unjust socioeconomic system. So I've talked about primitive accumulation before, but I didn't actually use that term. So for anyone who's like, this fucking jargon, yeah, so basically I've talked before about like the antecedents of capitalism, and basically violent dispossessions of people from their land, like Indigenous people, smallholders, peasants, self-sufficient agriculture producers. The dispossession of these people from their lands, the enclosure of these lands, the privatization of these lands, basically sets the stage for capital accumulation, because the dispossessed people have no other choice but to sell their labor then for a wage, become wage workers. So basically they are just left at the mercy of the exploitative labor system for their survival. So what is unique or terrible and horrible and just the worst about this settler colonial experience is that, the people who have been dispossessed from their lands, Indigenous people who have been dispossessed from their lands, their labor isn't actually needed. Okay, we've taken your land, so you are now, proletarianized, but we don't actually want your labor. Like, we want your land, we don't want you. So one major way that this enclosure and dispossession was carried out was through the creation of conservation spaces. And of course, this is like a very benevolent, wonderful reason to be, violently dispossessing people from their land. So where I work in Jasper and Banff, this is exactly what happened. First Nations were kicked out of the parks. Many of them signed treaties with the government, which should have allowed them to continue their traditional livelihoods within their traditional territories, even if it overlapped with park boundaries. And, like at the beginning, in the beginning, this kind of went on. They were still allowed to hunt and trap in their traditional territories. But very quickly, the interests of wealthy white sport hunters completely overshadowed the interest of Indigenous people. Sport hunters thought that subsistence hunting was barbaric, it was, I don't know, it was dirty. So, okay, killing an animal to eat it and use every part of it for, you know, clothing and whatever else you're gonna use it for is barbaric and horrible and unsportsmanlike. But shooting animals just for the fuck of it, like that's noble. That's like, oh my God. Yeah, I can't even. Through progressive rounds of legislation, they were barred from practicing traditional livelihoods in the park, basically barred from entering the park and even doing, you know, cultural ceremonies or anything. So many were moved to reserves around in the area. And this is like the same story for a lot of the southern parks in Canada. Like in the Riding Mountain Park, they kicked out the Ojibwe very, very violently, burned their houses to the ground and everything. But anyway, this is, you know, this is a common story that happened throughout Canada because up until the 1970s, federal policy towards Indigenous people was just like wildly assimilationist. I mean, it was genocidal, and then it was assimilationist, which is like, you know, if you're talking to an Indigenous person, like that's basically the same as genocide. So some of the like assimilation tactics used, yeah, they progressively just undermined First Nations abilities to actually practice their traditional livelihoods in their traditional territories. They moved them to reserves and they encouraged them to farm because farming was supposed to be this like super civilized activity and they could engage in capitalist markets. They're basically just trying to turn them into civilized capitalists. Of course, they only gave, you know, the really shitty plots of land that they didn't want to Indigenous people for reserves. So like these reserves were not in very agriculturally productive areas. They were basically just like the shit areas that they didn't care about. That's where the reserves were put. The government, you know, recognizing that they have a responsibility to First Nations, was providing rations and different things like support to the different reserves and communities. But the austerity, several rounds of budget cuts just basically reduced the rations and the help provided to First Nations. And so yeah, like here we are on the reserve, no food, we can't practice our traditional livelihoods. You're telling us to just like go be capitalists, and like what the fuck are we supposed to do, you know? And so a lot of First Nations communities, especially on reserve, are suffering so greatly today. I saw in some, you know, expose that Canada is obviously a first world nation and it was ranked, you know, 6th place on this development index. And if you ranked First Nations within Canada on that same index, they would be like 63, so below Libya. But access to education, access to healthcare, access to basic necessities of life are a big problem in many of these reserves. Suicide rates are extremely high. You know, alcoholism and things are a problem because people just have no hope. And in a lot of places, they're being subjected to like wild environmental injustice. So like Grassy Narrows in Ontario, like their river is poisoned with mercury and we still haven't cleaned it up. Like we still have not cleaned it up. Fort Chipewyan, I'll leave a link to a documentary below. They live up near the fucking tar sands, which is like, oh, and the water that they're using is similarly full of poisons, toxins. They have like an 8 times higher cancer rate or something like that than normal Canadians. Like not only are their territories stolen, but we are just exploiting the shit out of all of them for resource development that actually poisons where they're living. So after like the 1970s, about federal policy towards Indigenous people started to shift from being just like outwardly unapologetically genocidal and assimilationist to this kind of like liberal politics of recognition and reconciliation. So this is where I'm going to shout Coulthardt's work because it's awesome, and he draws on Fanon, who draws on Hegel. Basically the argument is that seeking recognition or reconciliation from a colonizer is basically always going to be self-defeating, because for the colonized group, like seeking recognition from the colonizer, like First Nations basically have to implicitly concede that the Canadian state is just, it's legitimate, its sovereign authority is legitimate, and that, you know, they have the power to actually bestow or disallow rights for Indigenous peoples. So Coulthard says, instead of ushering in an era of peaceful coexistence grounded on the ideal of reciprocity or mutual recognition, the politics of recognition in its contemporary liberal form promises to reproduce the very configurations of colonialist, racist, patriarchal state power that Indigenous peoples' demands for recognition have historically sought to transcend. And he's obviously drawing on Fanon, who talks about how anti-colonial struggles need to be anti-capitalist struggles as well, because, you know, racist colonial treatment and marginalization, etc., is clearly exasperated and, you know, maintained through the reproduction of this capitalist mode of production, especially if the colonizers' wealth and privilege and power has been and is continuing to be built on the backs of the colonized. But thinking about like the subjective realm of colonization and the socio-economic one, Fanon says that the colonized person must wage war on both. So that's exactly what the Dene did, and Coulthard is actually a Dene person, I suppose. But anyway, in 1976, the Dene created this proposal, this land claim proposal, and presented it to the government of Canada. So they were calling for, you know, an extensive set of principles, like the right to self-determination, the right to retain ownership of a significant amount of their traditional territory, the right to preserve their languages and customs, etc., the right to have political jurisdiction over their own areas, and most interestingly, the right to, you know, develop and operate their own indigenous economies. So politically, they wanted to operate like a non-hierarchical system of governance through direct democracy and consensus-based forms of decision-making. They wanted land to be held communally, so communal ownership of land, communal ownership of the means of production. They wanted to structure most of their economy around, you know, self-sufficiency. And then over and above that would be like a community scale activities that would help to furnish whatever else they needed, locally operated and democratically controlled manufacturing ventures, like native-run co-ops, and just worker-controlled enterprise in general. So this proposal was obviously torn apart. They were told that like, this must not be the work of the Dene, this must be like, you must have been taken in or something by academics in Toronto or something like that. But no, it was their policy, but yeah, they were criticized for just being these like radical leftists. So the government completely squashed that, but like what kind of, you know, what kind of respect for sovereignty and what kind of respect for self-determination is even possible in this situation that is so paternalistic? Like what's even possible in a system where you're looking to your oppressor for recognition, for rights? Like in my work in Jasper and Banff, I looked at, you know, private development in the park, and yeah, no First Nations people are benefiting whatsoever from the development of these capitalist businesses, these huge hotels, these huge everything being developed within the park on First Nations territory. They are not benefiting. So all of this, like, this is just continuing to facilitate the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands to facilitate capitalist gains for just like rich white people. And, you know, it's ironic because especially in Jasper and Banff, like First Nations people were kicked out of the park and put on these reserves, but white settlers were allowed to develop these really modern town sites. Like if you go to Banff today, it is like, there's like Lululemon and Louis Vuitton, and like it's like a mall. It's like it's insane, right? And then there's these huge, like super expensive hotels and everything. It's like, it's ritzy. So for things like that, like, you know, private development or resource development, like pipelines and all of this shit that's fucking up Indigenous territories, the Crown is obligated, like we have a duty to consult, so it's their duty to properly consult First Nations whose Aboriginal rights or title might be impacted by development. However, the duty to consult, much like the liberal politics of recognition, is similarly so paternalistic and so flawed. It's again premised on the idea that the Canadian state has the legitimate authority to either bestow or withhold certain rights onto Indigenous peoples within this, you know, just Canadian legal system. And even though traditional livelihoods and Aboriginal rights are supposed to be protected through this consultation mechanism, justifiable infringement allows the state to infringe on these rights for like any host of reasons. So if Aboriginal or treaty rights conflict with the economic imperatives of the Canadian state or the broader settler public, they will be justifiably denied. Under the conservative Harper government, things got worse. They passed Bill C-45, which set off the whole like Idle No More movement. If anyone has heard of that, maybe I'll put a link below or something. With Trudeau, people thought it would, or hoped it would get better because he said that he was going to respect and implement UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and as part of that, Indigenous peoples are supposed to have to give free, prior, and informed consent if there's anything being done that could threaten their Aboriginal rights. Then the whole Clyde River seismic blasting thing came up, and he was kind of like trying to backpedal out of the statement that he made about free, prior, and informed consent. And then of course there's the Trans Mountain Pipeline that's now been approved, and you know, a lot of Indigenous people have not given their free, prior, and informed consent to this development. There's been a lot. There's honestly there's so much more I could talk about, but I think this is already getting too long, so I think I'll just kind of wind it down. And I will end with a beautiful quote from Coulthart. Of course, capitalism continues to play a core role in dispossessing us of our lands and self-determining authority, but it only does so with the aid of other forms of exploitation and domination configured along racial, gender, and state lines. A struggle for Indigenous self-determination must challenge the relationship between settler colonization and the free market fundamentalism in ways that refuse to be co-opted by scraps of recognition, opportunistic apologies, and the cheap gift of political and economic inclusion. For Indigenous nations to live, capitalism must die. And for capitalism to die, we must actively participate in the construction of Indigenous alternatives to it. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you got something from that. Sorry if it was all over the place. And check out Mad Blender and Vegan Sista's channels for further discussions on institutional racism.